For 20 years a king was kept from his home. He would face a giant who fed on men, a witch who transformed sailors into beasts, voices sweet enough to lure ships to their ruin, and the endless anger of the god of the sea. Yet after every storm, every lost companion, and every distant shore, Odysseus longed for only one thing: the small, windswept island of Ithaca, where his wife and son still waited beneath the olive trees. Tonight, as the Mediterranean waves move slowly beneath a sky of ancient stars, we will follow the extraordinary voyage of Odysseus. The wandering king whose struggle to return home became one of the oldest and most enduring stories ever told. Now, settle comfortably, listen to the soft creaking of distant ships and the gentle whisper of olive leaves in the night breeze, and let the voyage home begin. In the age remembered by the singers of ancient Greece, after the bright walls of Troy had fallen and its smoke had long thinned into the wide Aegean sky, one man remained absent from his own hearth. His name was Odysseus, king of the small rocky island of Ithaca, and though the Great War was over, the sea had not yet released him. The world knew the names of warriors who had returned with bronze spoils and scarred hands, stepping ashore beneath the welcoming shade of their native hills. Yet Odysseus, clever in counsel and patient in hardship, was held somewhere beyond the familiar routes of sailors, beyond the blue horizons where gulls circled and the low Mediterranean waves broke in slow, regular breaths. Ithaca lay among the western Greek islands, a rough and narrow land of stony ridges, dark green slopes, and small coves where fishing boats could rest. It was not a kingdom of broad golden plains or towering palaces, but a place of olive trees, goat paths, clear springs, and houses built close against the wind. At dawn, mist often rested in the valleys, softening the hard outlines of the hills and turning the distant coastline pale as old silver. Then the sun rose quietly over the water, touching the roofs, the terraces, and the leaves of the olive groves until every branch seemed to carry a gentle, dusty light. In the evenings the island grew still beneath the first stars, and the air smelled of warm earth, wood smoke, sea salt, and crushed herbs beneath bare feet. From the shore came the unhurried washing sound of the tide, a hush and retreat as if the sea itself were sleeping. There, in a house overlooking the harbour and the low fields beyond, Penelope waited for her husband. She had waited through the 10 hard years of the Trojan War, and then through many further years in which every ship arriving from the west seemed to carry news of someone else. Her son Telemachus had been an infant when Odysseus sailed away with the Greek fleet. Now he was nearly grown, tall enough to stand in the doorway of his father's hall and look towards the sea with the quiet, troubled expression of a man trying to remember a face he had known only from stories. The palace of Ithaca was a substantial house, by the standards of its island world, with a great central hall, storerooms, courtyards, and long wooden benches polished by generations of use. Its roof timbers had darkened with hearth smoke, and its floors carried the soft scuffing of sandals, the light tap of wooden cups, and the steady movement of servants through familiar rooms. In happier years, travellers and neighbours had found welcome there. A stranger arriving at dusk might have heard the dogs settle in the yard, the hiss of meat over the fire, and the low murmur of conversation beneath the rafters before being offered water, bread, and a place by the warmth. But the house no longer held the order of a king's home. It had become crowded with men who arrived in fine cloaks and stayed far longer than courtesy allowed, each one hoping to take the place of the absent Odysseus. They were the suitors of Penelope, young nobles from Ithaca and the neighbouring islands, men with polished brooches, handsome horses, and a great confidence in their own importance. Day after day they gathered in Odysseus's hall, calling for wine, meat, music, and laughter, while the household stores slowly disappeared. Their voices rose in the evenings above the quieter sounds of the estate. Cups struck tabletops, chairs scraped against stone, and dice clicked and rolled across the floor, while outside the night wind moved through the olive branches with a far more peaceful purpose. They ate cattle from Odysseus's herds and goats from his hillsides. They opened jars of oil and wine meant to last through winter, and they seemed to believe that the king's long silence had already made them masters of his house. Penelope endured them with a calm that had become almost legendary. She did not welcome their presence, and she did not promise her hand to any one of them, but neither could she easily drive them away while Odysseus's fate remained unknown. For in that old world, a woman without clear word of her husband's death stood at the centre of a difficult and dangerous uncertainty. Penelope was queen, mother, and keeper of a household, yet every passing season increased the pressure placed upon her by men eager to turn uncertainty into advantage. Still, she had the rare patience of one who understood that time itself could be used as a shield. With measured words and a composed face, she told the suitors that she must first complete a burial shroud for Laertes, the aged father of Odysseus. It would not do, she explained, for the old king to die without the proper cloth prepared for his funeral rites. The suitors accepted the task as reasonable, for they believed that all weaving must eventually come to an end, just as a thread must eventually reach the edge of the loom. Each morning Penelope sat before the great upright loom in her chamber. The wool passed softly between her fingers, and the wooden frame gave a faint, gentle creak as she worked, while servants moved quietly nearby and daylight entered through the high openings in the wall. The fabric grew beneath her hands in pale, patient length. It was work suited to the rhythm of an island household, steady, dignified, and apparently without mystery, accompanied by the distant cooing of doves and the hush of wind stirring the courtyard leaves. But when darkness fell and the suitors' feasting continued below, Penelope returned to the loom by lamplight. The flame trembled in the small bronze lamp, and the threads of the day were slowly drawn apart beneath her careful fingers. Night after night she unravelled what she had woven under the sun. The soft whisper of loosened wool became the hidden sound of her resistance, almost too quiet to hear, yet stronger than the loud boasts echoing in the hall below. For 3 years the ruse held. The suitors believed that the shroud advanced, though never swiftly enough for their liking, and Penelope bought each new day with the work she removed each night. At last one of the household women revealed the secret. Perhaps she had been frightened, perhaps persuaded, or perhaps worn down by the watchful presence of the suitors. But the tale reached their ears, and Penelope's private defence was exposed. The men came to her chamber and saw the loom, the unfinished cloth, and the evidence of all those patient nights. From then onward, their demands grew sharper, and the palace seemed to narrow around Penelope and Telemachus like a room slowly filling with water. Telemachus felt this pressure more deeply with every season. He watched the suitors take his father's place at the tables, command the servants, and speak over the household as if he were a child whose voice could safely be ignored. There were moments when he stood alone on the shore with pebbles cool beneath his sandals and the breeze lifting the edge of his cloak. Before him stretched the darkening sea, its waves folding one after another against the coast, each slow arrival and retreat carrying him no answer. He had heard many accounts of Odysseus. Old men spoke of the king's steady mind, of his gift for finding a path through difficulty, and of the strange wooden horse by which Troy had finally been taken. But stories not the same as presents. Telemachus knew the sound of his father's name, yet not the sound of his father's voice. He knew the shape of the palace, yet not how it felt when Odysseus had walked through its doors. Far away from Ithaca, beyond the paths usually sailed by merchant ships and fishing boats, Odysseus sat beside another shore. He was on the island of Ogygia, a place concealed in the immense distances of the sea, where the nymph Calypso kept her dwelling. Ogygia was no harsh prison of iron walls. It was beautiful in the manner of things that can be most difficult to leave, green with cypress and alder, fragrant with cedar smoke, watered by clear springs, and surrounded on every side by the restless blue expanse. Calypso's cave stood among vines and flowering trees. 4 springs flowed near its entrance, each making a light, cool sound over the stones, while birds nested in the branches, and the air carried the mingled scent of sea wind, damp earth, and wild herbs. There were no shouting suitors there, no crowded hall, no hungry demands upon the stores of a household. There was only the gentle activity of the island, the murmur of the water, the flutter of wings, and the slow, tireless breathing of the sea. Calypso loved Odysseus. She offered him food, shelter, warmth, and the possibility of a life beyond age, illness, and death, a life in which he might remain forever in a place of quiet beauty. Yet even such gifts could not soothe the longing that had settled within him. Each day, Odysseus went down to the shore and sat upon a rock above the waves, his eyes turned towards a homeland too distant to see. There he wept for Ithaca. The sea came in with its calm, repeated breaking against the stones, and then withdrew in white lines of foam, while the hero watched the horizon as though the mere act of looking might make a path appear. A man might be offered immortality, the songs later said, and still desire the smoke rising from his own hearth. Odysseus remembered the rugged hills of Ithaca, the olive trees, the old dog in the yard, the voice of Penelope, and the son who had grown without him. Above the human world the gods observed these long years. The Greeks imagined their immortals gathered on the heights of Olympus, where cloud rested upon the mountain, and the homes of the gods shone beyond the reach of ordinary weather. There, among the divine company, Athena spoke for Odysseus. She was the goddess of clear thought, craft, wise counsel, and the disciplined courage that does not need to shout, and she had long favoured the king of Ithaca. Athena remembered the man who could think in darkness and act with care when others were driven by anger. She reminded Zeus, ruler of the gods, that Odysseus had endured enough wandering, and that his suffering had stretched too far beyond the ending of the war. Zeus listened from his high seat, while the thought of mortal lives passed before him, like distant ships crossing a bright sea. He knew that Poseidon still bore anger against Odysseus, for the Cyclops Polyphemus, whom the king had blinded, was Poseidon's son. But Zeus also knew that no storm lasts forever. He gave his assent, and the long motion of fate began, almost silently, to turn Odysseus towards home. Athena did not first go to Ogygia. Instead, she travelled to Ithaca, where the trouble in Odysseus's hall had deepened, and where Telemachus stood on the edge of manhood, uncertain what strength he possessed. She came in disguise, as gods often did in the old tales, taking the form of Mentes, a trusted visitor from across the sea. To the people of the ancient Mediterranean, a stranger at the threshold might be a merchant, a fugitive, a friend, or a god concealed beneath dust and travelling clothes. Telemachus welcomed the visitor with the courtesy his father had taught the household. Though the suitors filled the hall with noise, he brought Mentes aside, offering a seat and speaking with the restrained hope of someone who had waited too long for news. The banquet continued around them. A singer played the lyre, its notes clear and mournful beneath the beams, while servants carried bread and bowls of wine through the warm, smoky air. Penelope heard the song and came down from her chamber, her veil falling softly around her face. The singer was telling of the Greeks' bitter homecomings after Troy, and the music touched too closely upon the grief she kept guarded within her. She asked him to choose another tale, but Telemachus, surprised perhaps by his own firmness, told his mother that songs must follow the will of the singer, and that she should return to her weaving. His words were not cruel. They were the first uncertain words of a young man beginning to understand that the empty place in his father's house could no longer be filled by silence alone. Athena, still wearing the face of Mentes, encouraged him. She told Telemachus that he should call the people of Ithaca into assembly, openly condemn the suitors' behaviour, and seek news of Odysseus from the older kings who had survived the war. He should travel first to Pylos, she said, where Nestor, ancient among the Greek rulers, still remembered the days before Troy. Then he should go to Sparta, where Menelaus, once husband to Helen and leader among the Greeks, might know more of those who had sailed home. The journey would not be easy for a young man who had scarcely travelled beyond his own island. But Athena spoke to him with such quiet certainty that the unknown sea began to seem less like a wall and more like a road. That night, after the lamps had burned low and the suitors had drifted away in groups, Telemachus lay awake. He heard the distant shifting of the household, a door closing softly, a servant's steps fading down a corridor, and beyond them all the low sea sound moving under the stars. The wind passed through the olive groves on the hillside, making the leaves murmur in countless small voices. It seemed, in the stillness, that Ithaca itself was breathing around him. The fields, the stone walls, the sleeping animals, and the harbour waiting in darkness below. At dawn, the island awoke in gradual layers of sound. Roosters called from courtyards, goats moved along the slopes with their small bells chiming faintly, and the first boats rocked against their moorings, their wooden hulls giving soft creaks to the rising tide. Telemachus called an assembly of the Ithacans. Men gathered in the open meeting place, leaning upon staffs or sitting on worn stones, while the sun climbed slowly over the ridges and the salt wind carried the smell of the harbour through the crowd. It was the first assembly held since Odysseus had sailed for Troy. The old men who remembered him must have felt the weight of years in that moment, for a boy who had once stood at his mother's side now rose to speak where his father had once spoken. Telemachus described the destruction of his household. He asked the people to intervene, to persuade the suitors to return to their own homes, and to stop the waste of a king's estate while the king's fate remained uncertain. The suitors answered with polished, empty arguments. Their leader, Antinous, placed the blame upon Penelope, complaining of her delays and her weaving, as though patience were a crime and greed a virtue. Another, Eurymachus, spoke more smoothly, suggesting that Telemachus should send his mother away to choose a husband. But beneath their fine words lay the same hard intention. They would remain in the palace until they had taken what they wanted. The people of Ithaca listened, but none rose with the force needed to remove the suitors. Their silence was not approval so much as fear, habit, and the weary uncertainty that can settle over a community when no clear authority remains. Telemachus felt the loneliness of that silence. Yet he did not yield, and when the gathering dispersed, he turned his mind towards the voyage Athena had urged him to make. Athena returned in another disguise, this time as Mentor, an older friend of Odysseus. She moved through the preparations with a calm efficiency, finding a ship, gathering a small crew, and encouraging Telemachus to act before doubt could take hold again. As evening gathered over Ithaca, the sailors made ready in the harbour. They carried jars of wine and water, sacks of grain, and provisions for the days ahead, their footsteps dull upon the planks of the pier. The ship waited with its dark hull resting lightly on the water. Its mast rose against the violet sky, and its ropes murmured in the breeze, while the slow waves tapped the wood with the gentle patience of a hand against a sleeping child's door. And Telemachus walked down to the shore beneath the cover of night. Behind him, the palace stood quiet at last, though the suitors slept within it, unaware that the young man they had dismissed was slipping away across the sea. The crew took their places. Oars settled into their rowlocks. The sail was lifted, and the vessel eased from the harbour with a long, soft, creaking sound, leaving only widening ripples where it had been. Athena sent a fair wind from behind them. It filled the sail without violence, and the ship began to glide westward and then southward over the dark open water, steady as a thought finally given direction. On board, the sailors spoke little. The sea moved beneath the keel in long, smooth breaths, and the wooden vessel answered with its familiar comforting groan as it rose and settled upon the small night waves. Telemachus stood for a while at the stern, watching Ithaca become a darker shape against the horizon. Above him the stars spread in quiet abundance, the same stars that shone over Penelope at her loom, and over Odysseus beside Calypso's distant shore. Soon the island was lost in the night. The young prince sat among the sailors, listening to their deep, steady breathing and the soft slap of water along the hull, while the ship carried him onwards towards news, danger, and the first true step towards his father. Behind him, Penelope remained in the palace, surrounded by those who mistook waiting for weakness. Before him lay the sea, ancient and wide, whispering against the ship's dark sides as the voyage into the long story of Odysseus quietly began. Telemachus's small ship travelled through the night beneath a sky crowded with steady stars. The sail held the gentle wind sent by Athena, and the dark hull moved onwards with a quiet creaking, while the Mediterranean water folded and unfolded along its sides. The young prince remained awake for a time, listening to the measured dip of oars and the low voices of the sailors. Around him came the familiar maritime sounds of the ancient world. Rope rubbing against mast, water whispering beneath the keel, and the deep, even breathing of men resting between their watches. By morning, the coast of Pylos appeared in the east, pale beneath the early light. Long before the ship reached the shore, Telemachus could see thin columns of smoke rising from the land, drifting slowly above the low hills and the distant roofs. Pylos was the kingdom of Nestor, one of the oldest surviving leaders from the Trojan expedition. His memory reached back to an earlier generation, and in the songs of Greece he was known for his long speeches, his careful judgment, and the wisdom that years had laid upon him. Telemachus came ashore as the people of Pylos were making sacrifice beside the sea. They sat in many groups along the broad strand, and before them the waves arrived in calm white lines, breaking gently and retreating over the shingle with a sound like a long exhalation. The men were offering dark-coated bulls to Poseidon, lord of the sea, whose power was felt in every storm and every safe harbour. The smell of salt air mingled with wood smoke and roasting meat, while prayers rose softly into the brightening morning. For a young man who had seldom travelled beyond Ithaca, the gathering must have seemed immense. There were hundreds of people, cloaks moving in the breeze, bronze vessels catching the sun, and the distant steady murmur of cattle, gulls, and sea. Athena, still disguised as the elder mentor, stood beside him at the water's edge. Telemachus hesitated, for approaching an unknown king required courage, but the goddess told him that a wise question need not be feared. Together they joined the feast. Nestor welcomed the strangers according to the ancient laws of hospitality, offering food and drink before asking their names, because the traveller's need came first, and identity could wait until the hands had been warmed and the hunger eased. The sea continued its quiet conversation with the shore. As cups were raised and bread was broken, the sounds of the ritual settled into a calm rhythm. The soft crackle of firewood, the clink of bronze, and the gentle murmuring of those gathered under the open sky. When the meal was complete, Telemachus explained why he had come. He spoke of the suitors filling his father's hall, of Penelope's long waiting, and of the absence that lay over Ithaca like a cloud that would not lift. Nestor listened with grave kindness. He remembered Odysseus as a man whose intelligence had often matched or exceeded that of the greatest Greek chiefs, a companion who had seen beyond the immediate heat of battle. But the old king could offer little certainty. The homeward journey from Troy had scattered the Greek leaders, and the returning fleet had been divided by quarrels, storms, divine anger, and the unpredictable moods of the sea. Nestor told Telemachus of the final days at Troy, when the city's high walls had been breached and its long resistance had ended. In those days the Greek camp was full of smoke, broken armour, exhausted soldiers, and the strange stillness that follows a victory too costly to feel entirely like joy. Some men wanted to sail at once, eager to see their homes after 10 years of absence. Others lingered, uncertain whether the gods had been properly honoured or whether the fleet should depart as one. Agamemnon, commander of the Greek host, and Menelaus, king of Sparta, disagreed about the rites that should be performed before departure. Their argument divided the warriors, and the ships that had arrived together beneath the banners of many kingdoms began to leave in separate groups. Nestor himself sailed with one part of the fleet. He had travelled alongside Menelaus for a while, but soon their courses separated, as happens with ships and with lives, and he had heard no clear word of Odysseus after those early days. He did, however, advise Telemachus to continue to Sparta. Menelaus, he said, had wandered farther than most after Troy, and had returned only recently, carrying stories from Egypt, Cyprus, Phoenicia, and the far coasts where Greek sailors seldom went. The old king gave the young prince a place to rest for the night. In the palace of Pylos, Telemachus lay beneath a woven blanket, hearing the faint shifting of guards outside, the murmur of late conversation in distant rooms, and the evening wind slipping through the courtyard. At dawn, when the sky was the colour of pearl above the sea, Nestor arranged horses and a chariot for the journey inland. His son Pisistratus was sent to accompany Telemachus, for a guest should not be left to travel alone through unfamiliar lands. The two young men set out across the Peloponnese, the wheels of their chariot turning steadily over hard roads and dusty tracks. Hooves struck the ground in a gentle repeating rhythm, and the leather harnesses gave small regular creaks as the horses moved through the morning. They passed fields where farmers bent over the earth, groves of olive and fig, and villages of stone houses gathered near springs. In the heat of noon they rested beneath trees, where cicadas sang without haste and the leaves made a quiet dry rustle above them. At night they were received by families bound to Nestor's household. Firelight glowed against plastered walls, bowls of water were brought for washing, and the tired horses breathed softly in their enclosures while travellers shared bread by the hearth. It was a journey through a world held together by roads, kinship, exchange, and custom. Every village knew the value of a safe guest, for anyone might one day become a stranger on another shore, dependent upon the kindness of people whose names they did not know. At length, Telemachus and Pisistratus reached Sparta, lying in the valley of the river Eurotas beneath the slopes of Mount Taygetus. The air there was different from the salt wind of Ithaca, carrying the scent of river reeds, warm stone, horses, and the distant resin of mountain pine. Menelaus's palace stood rich with the treasures of a king who had returned from wide travels. Bronze shone on the walls, fine cloths covered chairs and benches, and cups of worked gold caught the lamplight with a soft, warm gleam. Yet the palace did not seem merely proud. Its wealth was tempered by the feeling of time past, by memories of war and wandering, and by the knowledge that beautiful objects could not entirely repay what had been lost. Telemachus arrived while a wedding feast was taking place. Menelaus was celebrating the marriages of his children, and music moved through the hall with the gentle ringing of lyre strings, accompanied by hand claps, measured footsteps, and the low hum of conversation. The servants received the travellers first, washing the dust from their hands and giving them seats at the feast. They ate without hurry, tasting bread, roasted meat, and wine mixed with water, while the evening deepened beyond the bright doorway. Menelaus looked at Telemachus and saw something familiar in the young man's face. There was a quiet gravity in his expression, and a resemblance that called to mind the absent king of Ithaca, though Menelaus did not at once speak the thought aloud. Helen entered the hall soon afterwards. In later generations, poets would surround her name with beauty, blame, and impossible legend, but in this quiet moment she came from her chamber, carrying a distaff of polished wood and attended by women of the household. She too looked upon Telemachus and recognized the likeness. His eyes, she said gently, seemed to belong to Odysseus, whose calm intelligence she remembered from the years before Troy and from the long siege beneath its walls. The name of Odysseus changed the atmosphere of the feast. It was as though a door had opened briefly onto an older world, filled with campfires on the plain of Troy, ships drawn up on the beach, and men speaking in low voices beneath a sky bright with foreign stars. Menelaus remembered the Trojan horse. He told of how Odysseus had devised that dangerous stratagem, hiding chosen warriors inside a great wooden shape, while the Greek army appeared to sail away. The Trojans had brought the horse within their city walls, believing it to be an offering or a sign of Greek defeat. That night, when the city slept, Odysseus and the others emerged, opened the gates, and allowed the returning Greek forces to enter. Helen remembered another part of the story. She had walked around the horse and called to the hidden warriors, imitating the voices of their wives, hoping perhaps to draw them into answering. Some men inside had nearly broken their silence. But Odysseus, alert even in that breathless darkness, held them back, covering the mouth of one restless companion until the danger had passed. The story carried both admiration and sadness. The fall of Troy had brought the Greeks victory, but it had also unleashed the long and difficult returns that followed, for no homecoming could be simple after so much bloodshed and grief. A singer in Menelaus's hall played a slow melody upon the lyre. The notes drifted beneath the high roof and seemed to settle like dust in the lamplight, gentle and mournful, while those at the feast remembered absent friends. Helen noticed that Telemachus's eyes had filled with tears. She asked the servants to mix a special herb into the wine, a drug remembered in Greek tradition, for easing sorrow and softening the sharp edge of memory. The ancient poets called it nepenthe, a substance said to have come from Egypt, where Menelaus and Helen had travelled during their long return, whether herb, legend or symbol. Of comfort, it belonged to the old belief that grief might sometimes be made quieter for a while. The wine passed among the guests. Outside, the night lay over Sparta with a soft darkness, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, water moved among the reeds of the Eurotas in a faint, continuous whisper. When morning returned, Menelaus spoke more fully of his own voyage. After Troy, he had travelled for years across unfamiliar seas, driven far from the direct route home by contrary winds and the wide, uncertain geography of the eastern Mediterranean. His ships had reached Cyprus, Phoenicia, Egypt, and lands near the edge of the world known to Greek imagination. He had seen strange harbours, foreign temples, and markets where sailors exchanged goods, stories and rumours gathered from many coasts. At last, upon the island of Pharos near Egypt, Menelaus had found himself held by windless weather. His ships rested in still water, their sails hanging loose, their ropes motionless, while the men waited day after day beneath a sun that seemed to burn without moving. Food diminished, and the sailors grew weary. The silence of a windless sea can be more unsettling than a storm, for it leaves a ship suspended in a vast brightness, with no sound but the faint knock of wood against water and the tired breathing of those aboard. Then Eidothea, daughter of the sea god Proteus, took pity on Menelaus. She told him that he must capture her father, the old man of the sea, who possessed the knowledge of hidden paths and the fates of men. Proteus tended seals along the shore. At midday he came from the water and slept among them, and Menelaus, following Eidothea's strange instructions, hid beneath seal skins with 3 of his companions. The smell was strong, and the shore was wet with seaweed and salt, but they remained still. They listened to the distant surf breaking in slow intervals, and to the heavy, restful breathing of the seals gathered around them. When Proteus lay down among his creatures, Menelaus seized him. The old sea god tried to escape by changing shape, becoming lion, serpent, leopard, boar, water, and tree, yet Menelaus held fast through each transformation. At last Proteus yielded and spoke. He told Menelaus how he might return to Sparta, but he also revealed the fates of other Greek leaders, whose names still haunted the minds of those who had sailed from Troy. Ajax the Lesser, Proteus said, had perished at sea after offending the gods. Agamemnon had returned to Mycenae only to be murdered in his own house by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, a warning that war could follow a man even beyond his own threshold. Then came the answer Telemachus had travelled so far to hear. Proteus had seen Odysseus alive, but held against his will on the island of Calypso, grieving beside the sea and longing for the homeland he could not reach. Menelaus told this part of the tale slowly, with the solemn care due to a young man receiving news of his father. Odysseus was not dead, he said, nor lost beyond all knowledge, but alive on a distant island, unable to find a ship or a crew to carry him home. For Telemachus, the news must have moved through him like the first warmth after a long winter. It was not the answer he most wished for, because his father still remained far away and powerless, but it was something solid at last. A living name, a known sorrow, a possible return. He imagined Odysseus on that remote shore, perhaps hearing the same sea sounds that reached Ithaca each night. Across all the distance between them, father and son were both turned towards the water, each waiting for a way home. Menelaus gave Telemachus gifts of fine workmanship, a mixing bowl of silver with a rim of gold, and a cloak for Penelope, bright and delicate as sunlight caught in a woven thread. Such objects were more than ornaments, for in the ancient world a gift carried memory, honour, and the promise of bonds between households. But Telemachus could not linger. News of Odysseus had strengthened his purpose, and he now felt the pull of Ithaca more urgently than before, for his mother remained alone among the suitors, and his father's house still required protection. Meanwhile, on Ithaca, the suitors learned that Telemachus had slipped away by sea. Their surprise soon hardened into anger, for they understood that he had gone to seek allies and knowledge, and that a young man with hope might become more dangerous than a quiet boy with none. Antinous proposed an ambush. He urged the others to take a swift ship and wait near the narrow strait between Ithaca and the neighbouring island of Sam, where Telemachus would likely pass on his way home. Their plan was made in the same hall where they continued to eat Odysseus's food. Outside, the afternoon wind moved gently through the olive branches, and the sounds of the household remained deceptively peaceful. Water poured into jars, sandals crossed the courtyard, and doves shifted softly on the roof. Penelope heard of her son's journey from the old nurse Eurycleia. At first, fear rose within her, for Telemachus had left without telling her, and the sea that had taken Odysseus from her now held her son as well. She thought of the wooden ship moving through darkness, its small sail lifted against the wind, its timbers answering the water with low, familiar creaks. She imagined the sailors' deep breathing beneath their cloaks and the black waves passing quietly beneath them, each one carrying the vessel farther from home. Then she heard of the suitors' plot. The knowledge settled over her like cold mist, and she wept for Telemachus, fearing that the men who had consumed her husband's estate might now try to extinguish the last living branch of his family. In her distress, Penelope prayed to Athena. She asked the goddess to guard Telemachus as he travelled, to keep him from the ambush, and to remember the house of Odysseus in its long hour of need. That night Athena came to Penelope in a dream, taking the likeness of her sister Iphthai. In the still chamber, where a lamp had burned low and the fabric on Penelope's loom rested unfinished in the shadows, the dream figure stood beside her bed. She told Penelope not to grieve too deeply. Telemachus had the favour of the gods, and though the sea could be wide and men could be cruel, his path would not end in the trap prepared by the suitors. Penelope woke with the faintest measure of comfort. Beyond the palace, the island lay silent beneath the stars, and the waves reached the shore in their unchanging rhythm, arriving, retreating, arriving again, as they had done before Odysseus sailed and as they would do when he returned. In Sparta, Telemachus prepared to leave before dawn. The palace servants moved quietly through the first grey light, bringing provisions and fastening gifts for the journey, while the horses shifted in their stalls and breathed clouds of warmth into the cool morning air. Pisistratus, Nestor's son, was ready to travel with him again. The two young men left the valley of Sparta in the chariot, wheels turning over the pale road as the high slopes behind them gradually caught the rising sun. Their return journey passed through the same fields and villages, but Telemachus was not the same traveller who had come that way. He now carried the certainty that Odysseus lived, and this knowledge gave a new weight to every road, every resting place, and every view of the sea. In Pylos he paused only briefly. Athena appeared once more, guiding him away from delays, and Telemachus asked Pisistratus to return to his father's house, while he himself made ready to sail directly for Ithaca. The ship was loaded in the evening. Grain, wine, and water were placed carefully within the hull. The crew took their stations, and the harbour gradually faded into the soft blue shadow of night. The sailors pushed away from the shore. Oars entered the water with quiet, even strokes, and when the wind came, the sail filled with a low fluttering sound before drawing taut above them. Telemachus stood near the stern looking out across the moonlit sea. The waves rose and fell beneath the ship in a slow, patient rhythm, and the vessel moved onwards with the mild groan of old timber, as though it too understood the importance of returning home. Athena watched over the voyage, though no mortal eye could see her. Ahead lay Ithaca, Penelope, the suitor's hidden vessel, and the difficult work of a son who had crossed the sea as a seeker, and was now coming back with the beginning of an answer. When Odysseus had finished speaking of his long separation from Ithaca, the hall of the Phaeacians grew quiet around him. The lamps burned steadily against the carved walls, and beyond the palace, the sea made its low, enduring sound upon the shore, as though it too had settled to listen. King Alcinous and Queen Arete had received the stranger with honour, though at first they had not known his name. Now, as his tears had risen at the song of Troy, and as he had revealed himself to be Odysseus, the lost king of Ithaca, they asked him to tell the full history of his wandering. Odysseus sat among them with a cup of dark wine resting in his hand. His voice, when he began, was measured and grave, carrying the memories of distant islands, vanished companions, and the unwearied movement of the sea. He began where his voyage after Troy had first touched land. The Greek ships had left the smoking ruins of the fallen city and sailed northward along the coast, their oars dipping into water that shone beneath the morning sun. For 10 years the men had lived in tents beside the plain of Troy. Now they stood once more upon their decks, smelling the resin of the ships, the salt wind, and the familiar dampness of ropes that had crossed so many miles of open water. The fleet was eager for home. Men spoke of wives, orchards, old parents, children who would scarcely remember them, and hearths where the sound of a wooden door closing at dusk might feel more precious than all the bronze taken in war. Yet the sea routes of the ancient world were never simply roads leading from one place to another. A vessel could be turned by a sudden wind, drawn towards an unfamiliar coast, or held in a harbour for days while sailors watched the horizon and listened to the slow crash of waves against stone. The ships of Odysseus came first to the land of the Cicones, a people who lived at Ismarus on the Thracian coast. The place rose beside a broad bay, where the sea was dark blue in deeper water and pale green near the shallows, and where vineyards climbed the warmer slopes inland. The men of Ithaca attacked the town. It was a harsh beginning to a homeward voyage, but such raids belonged to the grim customs of the age, when victorious armies carried their violence from one shore to the next. They took treasure and provisions, and they divided what they had seized among the crew. Odysseus urged them to return to the ships without delay, for he knew that a small victory on foreign ground could easily become a trap. But his men did not listen. They remained near the shore, drinking wine and slaughtering cattle, while the afternoon lengthened and a warm breeze moved through the grasses beyond the beach. The Cicones who had escaped rode inland to summon their allies. As evening approached, more warriors came down from the hills, their chariots and weapons catching the last light, while the sea continued to breathe quietly beside the waiting ships. At dawn, battle returned with sudden force. The men of Odysseus fought on the shore, hearing the clash of bronze, the sharp cries of horses, and the heavy tread of feet upon sand darkened by the waves. For a time they held their ground. But the Cicones came in greater numbers, and the Greeks were forced back towards the water, carrying their wounded companions as the surf rolled around their ankles. Many men were lost before the ships finally pushed away from the coast. The oars entered the water in hurried rhythm, and the vessels moved out across the bay, beneath a sky that had become pale and wind-streaked. Odysseus spoke of each loss with the restrained sorrow of one who had carried those names for years. For every ship that escaped, 6 men had fallen, left behind upon that distant shore, and the first hopes of homecoming grew quieter among the survivors. Then Zeus sent a storm. Clouds gathered in slow grey layers above the sea, and the wind that had once seemed merely fresh became colder, louder, and harder against the sails. The ships rolled upon the rising water, masts groaned, ropes snapped and fluttered, and the sailors bent to their oars with wet hands, while white foam swept over the decks and ran back into the dark sea. For 2 days and 2 nights they were driven away from their intended course. There was little sleep, only the sound of wind pressing through rigging, the hard slap of waves against timber, and the deep, strained breathing of exhausted men. On the 3rd day the storm weakened. The sailors lowered their shoulders, gathered their torn cloaks around them, and watched the sea settle from wild crests into long heaving swells. They rounded Cape Malea, the southern point of Greece, hoping soon to enter the waters that led towards Ithaca. But another current, another wind, and perhaps the invisible hand of the gods carried them far away to the south. After many days, land appeared once more. It was the country of the Lotus Eaters, a quiet place whose people lived near the edge of the known world, where low hills met a mild shore and the air lay soft above the water. No walls rose there to defend a city, and no armed men rushed down to meet the strangers. Instead, the inhabitants received them with a calm gentleness, offering food beneath the shade of trees while the sea murmured nearby. Odysseus sent a few men inland to learn who lived in that land. They walked away from the beach through grasses warmed by the sun, hearing insects hum in the still air and leaves whispering overhead. The lotus eaters gave them fruit from the lotus plant. In the ancient poem, this fruit did not bring pain or drunken confusion, but something far more dangerous to those who wished to return home. It made the eater forget. Those who tasted it no longer wanted to report back to the ships. They no longer cared for Ithaca, for parents, wives, children, or the familiar paths that had once shaped their lives. They wished only to remain among the lotus eaters, eating the sweet fruit and letting the days pass without memory or ambition. It was a soft captivity, a dream without terror, held beneath a warm sky and the faint, unchanging sound of distant surf. Odysseus found them weeping when he came to bring them back. They resisted him, not with weapons, but with the helpless sadness of men being asked to wake from a pleasant sleep. He dragged them to the ships and bound them beneath the benches. Then he ordered the others aboard at once, warning that no one should taste the lotus, however mild the fruit might seem in an open hand. The ships left that shore behind. Their oars moved in slow, firm strokes, and the sailors sat in silence, listening to the water run along the hulls, and perhaps wondering how easily a man might lose the desire for home. As the Phaeacians listened, the memory of that strange land seemed to hang in the hall like the fragrance of a distant flower. Even in the safety of a feast, there was something unsettling in the thought that forgetting could feel so peaceful. The voyage continued westwards across open water. Day after day, the sun travelled over the sky and sank into the sea, leaving the ships beneath a great canopy of stars while the sailors slept in turns beside their oars. Their wooden vessels were small by later standards, broad enough to hold men, weapons, food and water jars, yet always exposed to the temper of the sea. At night their planks creaked gently with the motion of the waves, and the sailcloth gave a faint flutter whenever the wind shifted. Then they reached an island green with goats. It lay near a larger coast, separated by a narrow stretch of water, and its slopes were covered with grass, low shrubs, and scattered trees bent slightly by the sea breeze. There were no people on the island, no harbour walls, no smoke rising from dwellings, only the cry of birds and the delicate ringing of goat bells carried over the hillside. Fresh water ran from a spring, and the travellers found welcome relief after the long journey. They hunted goats and made a meal upon the shore. Fires glowed among the rocks as evening descended, and the smell of roasting meat mingled with the salt of the tide and the sweet, dry scent of crushed wild thyme. Across the water stood the larger island. Its coast appeared rugged and high, with a wide cave visible near the shore, and grazing animals moving like pale shapes over the slopes. Odysseus wished to learn who lived there. He chose one ship and a small group of companions, leaving the rest on the goat island while they crossed the narrow water in the hush of early morning. The sea between the islands was calm. Oars entered and left the water with a quiet, measured sound, and the hull moved forward with the soft groan of ancient timber, carrying the men towards a place they did not yet understand. They landed near the cave and found it empty. Around its entrance stood pens made of stone, and within were baskets of cheese, pails filled with milk, and racks holding curds prepared by a careful hand. The men urged Odysseus to take what they could carry and sail away at once. It would have been the prudent choice, perhaps, for the cave belonged to someone of immense size, as the great cheeses, broad pens, and towering doorway all quietly suggested. But Odysseus wished to meet the owner. In the old customs of the Mediterranean, a stranger who entered a dwelling might expect a welcome, a meal, a gift, and the protection owed to any guest beneath a host's roof. So they waited. Afternoon light slipped across the hillside and the sound of grazing sheep drifted nearer. Bells tinkling softly, hooves clicking against stone, and the gentle bleating of animals being brought home at dusk. Then the owner appeared. Polyphemus was a Cyclops, one of a race of giant shepherds, and he came down from the high pasture carrying a great load of firewood on his back. He was enormous, solitary, and unlike the civilized people known to Greek cities. The poets imagined the Cyclopes as living without assemblies, laws, or shared customs, each dwelling alone in a cave and ruling only over his own household. Polyphemus drove his flock into the cave. His sheep and goats pressed inward with soft woolly sounds, filling the shadows with the warm smell of milk, straw, and animals that had spent the day under the sun. Last of all, he rolled a vast stone across the entrance. It moved with a deep scraping rumble and settled into place with such weight that no ordinary group of men could have shifted it. The Greek companions stood silently in the darkness. Behind them, the last daylight vanished, and before them the Cyclops built his fire, its flames crackling against the cave walls and throwing giant shadows across the baskets and pens. Polyphemus milked his animals with the methodical patience of a shepherd. The milk struck the pails in a soft foaming rhythm, and lambs and kids were placed beside their mothers, where they made small, sleepy sounds in the warm darkness. Only when the evening work was finished did the Cyclops notice the strangers. He turned his single eye towards them, and his voice, when he spoke, rolled through the cave like distant thunder. Odysseus answered respectfully. He explained that they were Greeks returning from Troy, men lost from their course by the sea, and he asked Polyphemus to respect the laws of hospitality guarded by Zeus. But Polyphemus had no reverence for such customs. He laughed at the mention of Zeus, saying that the Cyclops feared neither the gods nor the rules of smaller men. Then, with terrible ease, he seized 2 of Odysseus's companions. The poet tells the moment plainly, and the horror of it lies in that plainness. The giant killed and ate them as though they were no more than animals taken from his own flock. The men cried out, but the stone blocked the entrance, and the cave held their voices within its walls. Outside, the island night continued in peace, with the wind moving over the grass and the waves breaking in slow, patient intervals along the distant shore. Odysseus thought of killing the Cyclops while he slept. His sword was at hand, and anger rose in him, but he understood that without Polyphemus they could not move the immense stone sealing the cave. So he waited. It was the kind of waiting that had become part of his nature, not surrender, but the difficult calm of a mind searching for the one narrow path through danger. At dawn, Polyphemus rose and repeated his shepherd's work. He milked the ewes and goats, warmed the cave with a new fire, and then seized 2 more men for his morning meal. Afterwards he rolled the stone aside and led the animals out to pasture. The entrance opened briefly to a wash of bright sun and sea air, but the Cyclops closed it again as he departed, leaving the remaining Greeks trapped in the heavy shadow. All that day Odysseus considered the things within the cave. Near the fire stood a great club of green olive wood, cut from a tree trunk and left to dry until it might serve the giant as a walking staff. Odysseus and his men cut off a length of it. They sharpened the end, hardened it in the fire, and hid it beneath the dung and straw, working quietly while the island lay bright and indifferent outside. Among their supplies, Odysseus had brought a skin of unusually strong wine. It had been given to him by Maron, a priest of Apollo from the land of the Cicones, and it was so rich that it was normally mixed with many measures of water. When Polyphemus returned at evening, he followed the same routine. Sheep and goats came in first, their bells and bleats fading into the cave, and then the huge stone was rolled shut with its long final grinding sound. Again the Cyclops ate 2 men. Odysseus waited until the giant had finished, then approached with the wine, speaking gently and offering it as a gift after the meal. Polyphemus drank. The wine was dark, fragrant and powerful, and the giant asked for more, pleased by a drink unlike the milk and water of his ordinary life. Odysseus gave him another bowl, and then another. The wine warmed the Cyclops and softened his thoughts, while the firelight trembled upon the cave walls, and the sheep lay down in close quiet clusters. At last Polyphemus asked the stranger's name, promising a gift in return. Odysseus gave the answer that would save the survivors. He said that his name was Nobody. The Cyclops laughed and promised that nobody would be eaten last of all. It was a grim sort of gift, yet Odysseus accepted the moment without protest, for the giant's eyelid had grown heavy, and his voice had slowed. Soon Polyphemus fell asleep beside the fire. His breathing became deep and rough, rising and falling through the cave, while the wine sent a heavy stillness over his enormous body. Odysseus gave the signal. The men took the sharpened olive stake from its hiding place, heated its point in the glowing embers, and lifted it together with trembling arms. They drove it into the Cyclops' single eye. The fire-hardened wood hissed, and Polyphemus woke with a cry so vast that the cave seemed to shake around them. He tore the stake away and stumbled towards the entrance. His roar travelled out across the island, over the sleeping fields and the dark sea, and other Cyclops came from their neighbouring caves to ask what had happened. They stood beyond the stone and called to him. Who was hurting him, they asked, and was anyone trying to kill him by force or trickery? Polyphemus answered that nobody was hurting him. Nobody was trying to kill him, and the other Cyclops, unable to understand the cleverness hidden in the name, told him that if no one was attacking him, then he must endure the sickness sent by the gods. Their footsteps faded away across the hillside. Inside the cave, Polyphemus sat in pain and anger, feeling blindly for the small men who had escaped his hands. He did not move the stone. Instead, he opened the cave entrance at dawn and sat in the doorway, spreading his enormous arms across the passage so that no man could walk out with the flock. But Odysseus had thought through the night. He tied the strongest rams together in groups of 3, fastening a man beneath the belly of each middle animal, where the blind Cyclops' searching hands would only feel woolly backs. Odysseus himself chose the largest ram. He clung beneath its thick fleece, his arms wrapped around the warm body of the animal while the creature stood patiently among the restless flock. Morning came slowly, the cave filled with the quiet sounds of animals waking, hooves shifting on straw, low bleats, the faint clink of bells, and the blind giant's heavy breathing at the entrance. One by one, the rams passed out to pasture. Polyphemus ran his hands along their backs, feeling for men who might try to ride above the wool, but beneath them the Greeks held still and silent. The great ram came last. Polyphemus paused and stroked its back, wondering why his favourite animal was leaving the cave so slowly, and he spoke to it as a lonely shepherd might speak to the only creature that seemed to understand him. Outside, the light lay clear over the island. Odysseus felt the warmth of the sun and the salt breeze again, but he did not let go until the ram had travelled far enough from the cave. Then the men ran to the shore. Their feet struck the grass and stones, and their breath came quickly, while behind them the Cyclops remained within his cave, blind and furious in the deep shadow. They reached the ship and pushed it into the water. The oarsmen took their benches, and the hull moved away from the beach with a hurried splash of blades entering the sea. At first, Odysseus kept silent. The ship gained distance, the waves broadened between them and the shore, and the island's cliffs began to soften in the morning haze. But when they were safely beyond the reach of thrown stones, he called back to Polyphemus. He wanted the giant to know that he had not been defeated by a nameless weakling, but by a man of skill and courage. The Cyclops heard his voice and tore a great rock from the cliff. He hurled it towards the sound, and it struck the sea so close behind the ship that the water rose in a towering spray and drove the vessel back towards the shore. The men shouted for Odysseus to stop calling out. They begged him to let the sea carry them away in silence, but the fierce part of him, sharpened by loss and escape, would not yet be still. When the ship had gained distance once more, he called out his true name. He told Polyphemus that the man who had blinded him was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. At those words the Cyclops remembered an old prophecy. A seer had once told him that he would lose his sight at the hands of Odysseus, but Polyphemus had imagined a great warrior arriving in bright armour, not a smaller man using wine, wood, and patience. He raised his hands towards the open sky and prayed to Poseidon, his father. He asked the god of the sea that Odysseus should never return home, or, if fate made that impossible, that he should return late, broken by loss, alone, and find sorrow waiting in his house. The prayer moved out over the water. The sea seemed calm enough, with its slow blue swells and soft wind passing over the surface, but the name of Poseidon had entered the journey now, and its shadow would remain with Odysseus for many years. The ship sailed back to the Goat Island, where the other crews waited. The surviving men gathered on the shore, their faces drawn with fatigue, and they listened as Odysseus told them what had happened in the cave. They shared the goats that remained from the earlier hunt. Odysseus gave the great ram, whose patient strength had carried him to safety, as an offering to Zeus, though the god did not yet turn his favour towards their voyage. As evening settled over the island, fires burned low among the rocks. The waves came gently upon the shore, the breeze stirred the grasses, and the sailors lay close to their ships, their breathing slowly deepening as exhaustion overcame fear. By dawn the vessels were ready once more, their oars entered the water, their sails caught the early wind, and the small fleet turned away from the island of the Cyclops towards further seas, carrying freedom, grief, and the first terrible consequence of Odysseus's revealed name. After leaving the island of the Cyclops, Odysseus and his surviving companions sailed on across a sea that seemed, for a little while, almost forgiving. The waves rose and fell beneath their hulls with a slow, regular motion, and the ships answered with the familiar creaking of timber, rope, and mast. The men kept their eyes upon the horizon. Behind them, the rocky island of Polyphemus sank into blue distance, while ahead the morning light opened upon waters still unknown to them, broad and gleaming beneath the sun. Odysseus carried the memory of the Cyclops' prayer in silence. A curse spoken to Poseidon, lord of the deep sea, was no small thing, and even the quietest wave might now seem to conceal the distant attention of that powerful god. Yet sailors cannot remain forever with their thoughts. They must draw water, mend ropes, share food, watch the colour of the sky, and rest when rest is offered, while the sea continues its patient labour around them. For several days the fleet travelled under fair winds. At night the sailors lay close beneath their cloaks on the decks, listening to the gentle flap of sailcloth and the soft repeating wash of water along the hulls. Sometimes when the moon was bright the oars rested and the ships moved beneath the wind alone. You might imagine the men looking upwards at the same fixed constellations that watched over Ithaca, while the darkness around them breathed with the deep, steady rhythm of the Mediterranean. At last they came to the floating island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. In the imagination of the ancient Greeks, it was an island surrounded by a high wall of bronze, smooth and shining beneath the daylight, with cliffs of dark rock rising within it. There, Iolaus lived with his family in a house where the sound of feasting mingled with the remote murmuring of trapped winds. The god was said to understand every current of air that crossed the sea, the gentle west wind that filled a sail, the dry northern wind sweeping over mountain paths, and the sudden gales that could turn a voyage into ruin. Odysseus and his men were welcomed by Aeolus for an entire month. The hall was warm with fires, and the travellers, weary of strange shores and danger, rested while outside the bronze wall the waves continued to break in slow white lines against the rocks. Each evening Odysseus spoke with Aeolus of Troy, the long siege, and the scattered fates of the Greeks. In return, Aeolus asked about the distant cities and their kings, while servants moved quietly through the hall and the wind made a low singing sound around the island's high walls. At the end of the month, Odysseus asked for help in reaching Ithaca. Aeolus, perhaps touched by the wanderer's persistence, gathered all the dangerous winds into a great leather bag, binding its mouth with a shining silver cord. Only the gentle west wind was left free. It would blow steadily behind the ships, carrying them towards Ithaca with the kind of calm progress sailors remembered for years. A filled sail, an even keel, and the soft creak of wood moving easily through water. Odysseus placed the bag beneath the stern of his ship. He guarded it carefully, never letting it leave his sight, because in that tightly bound skin lay the force of storms, gales, and wild currents waiting for release. For 9 days the ship sailed without disaster. The men watched the coastline of familiar Greece gradually return to the far horizon, and hope moved through the fleet like warmth after a cold night. On the 10th day Ithaca appeared. Its ridges stood dimly beyond the water, and the sailors could almost see the smoke of distant hearths rising from the island where their families waited. Odysseus had not slept properly for many days. He had kept watch beside the precious bag, listening to the sea and measuring the wind, while the others rested in turns beneath the quiet, drawn sail. At last, overcome by exhaustion, he slept. His breathing grew slow and deep beside the stern, while above him the lines hummed gently, and the ship moved nearer to the land he had desired through every hardship. The sailors looked at the bag. They had watched Odysseus guard it so closely, and suspicion, that old companion of tired men, began to speak among them in low voices. They wondered whether it held gold, silver, or some rare gift from Aeolus that Odysseus meant to keep for himself. Perhaps, they thought, their king would return to Ithaca richer than any of them, while they who had fought and suffered beside him would have nothing but worn cloaks and empty hands. So, while the coast of Ithaca lay close enough for them to imagine the sound of dogs in its courtyards, they loosened the silver cord. The mouth of the bag opened, and all the captive winds burst out at once. The sea changed in a breath. The calm surface broke into running ridges, sails cracked and strained, ropes shrieked against the masts, and the ships were seized as though invisible hands had caught them and turned them violently away from shore. Odysseus woke to the roar. He saw Ithaca vanish behind rain and spray, saw the sailors struggling at their oars, and knew at once what had happened. For many hours the winds drove the fleet backwards through the water. The men rowed until their arms shook, and the ships rose and fell beneath a sky crowded with clouds, while the sound of the storm filled every space between their frightened breaths. At length, battered and ashamed, they returned to Aeolia. The bronze walls rose again before them, but they were no longer welcomed as fortunate guests arriving beneath a god's protection. Odysseus entered Aeolus's hall and begged for aid once more. Yet Aeolus looked upon him with fear, believing that a man pursued by such repeated misfortune must be hated by the gods, beyond any mortal help. He ordered Odysseus away. The king of Ithaca returned to his ship without a second gift, while the sailors waited in silence beneath the walls, hearing only the restless wind and the slow wash of water against the shore. For 6 days and nights they rowed. No favourable breeze lifted their sails, and the fleet moved by human effort alone, each oar dipping and rising with a dull, weary rhythm. The men's hands blistered around the wood, their shoulders ached, their heads grew heavy in the sun, and when darkness fell they heard the soft groaning of the ships, the occasional cough of a sailor, and the deep, exhausted breathing of bodies stretched between the rowing benches. On the 7th day, a strange coast came into view. It had steep cliffs, a narrow harbour, and high headlands that seemed to lean over the water, holding the inlet in a dark enclosed embrace. This was the land of the Laestrygonians, a people remembered in the poem as giants, fierce and unnatural in their hunger. The ancient singer placed them at the edge of a world where ordinary geography gave way to rumour, wonder and danger. The fleet entered the harbour. All the ships except that of Odysseus passed between the enclosing cliffs and moored within the still water, where the surface reflected the rock walls in shadowy, broken shapes. Odysseus, cautious after so many disasters, tied his own vessel outside the harbour entrance. There it rose and settled with the open sea, its ropes creaking against the rock, while the others rested tightly gathered in the quiet inlet. He sent 3 men ashore to learn who lived there. They walked along a path beside a spring, where clear water ran over smooth stones, and the only sound at first was the gentle trickle of the stream and the distant calls of seabirds. They met a tall woman carrying a water jar. She told them that the ruler of the land was Antiphates, and directed them towards his house, which stood beyond the settlement beneath the looming hills. But when they entered, they found not welcome but terror. The king's wife, vast and frightening, called out to Antiphates, and he seized one of the men and killed him before the others could flee. The 2 survivors ran back to the shore. Behind them came shouts from the town and the heavy movement of giants descending from the slopes, their voices echoing between the cliffs like storm wind in a mountain pass. The Laestrygonians began to throw rocks down into the harbour. Great stones fell upon the crowded ships, striking wood and water with thunderous crashes, breaking masts, splintering hulls, and sending men into the sea. The narrow inlet became a place of ruin. Ships that had rested close together could not turn or escape, and the waves filled with broken timbers, scattered oars, and the cries of sailors carried briefly before being swallowed by the noise. Odysseus cut the rope of his own ship. His crew bent to the oars, and the vessel pulled away from the entrance while the sounds behind it grew fainter. Stone striking stone, wood breaking, water rushing through opened hulls. Only one ship escaped. When evening came, the survivors sat in stunned quiet beneath the open sky, and the sea around them had returned to its ordinary movement, rising and lowering the ship with a calm, almost painful after so much destruction. The little vessel sailed onwards, carrying Odysseus and the last remnant of the fleet that had once left Troy in strength. The men had become fewer, their voices softer, and their shared memories heavier with every island left behind. Then they reached Aeaea, the island of Circe. It lay low and wooded upon the water, fragrant with cedar, pine, and flowering herbs, while smoke rose in a thin, peaceful line from somewhere within the forest. The shore offered shelter. A small bay received the ship, and the sailors dragged it above the reach of the waves, where its wet hull gleamed in the sun and made a faint wooden creak as it settled onto the sand. For 2 days, grief and exhaustion held them still. They ate what little food remained, drank water in careful measure, and listened to the soft movement of leaves above their resting place. Odysseus climbed a hill on the 3rd day. From its summit he saw the island spread beneath him, forested slopes, a distant plume of smoke, and sea on every side, wide and pale beneath the afternoon sky. He returned to the shore with a deer he had killed for food. The men received it with quiet gratitude, and that evening they ate beside the ship while the waves made their slow rhythm on the beach and the shadows lengthened among the trees. The next morning Odysseus divided the crew into 2 groups. One, led by Eurylochus, would search for the smoke and any people living inland, while Odysseus remained with the others near the coast. Eurylochus and his companions walked through the woods. The path was soft with fallen needles, and around them the forest held a gentle hush, broken by bird calls, the rustle of unseen creatures, and the distant sighing of wind in high branches. They came upon a clearing where a house stood among the trees. Lions and wolves moved around it, but they did not attack. Instead, they approached with strange tameness, their tails moving slowly as though they were household dogs. The animals had once been men, though the explorers could not know it at first. Circe, the lady of the island, had enchanted them with herbs and spells, altering their forms but leaving something of their human awareness behind their watchful eyes. From within the house came the sound of a woman singing. Her voice moved gently through the open doorway, accompanied by the soft, repeated knock of a loom as she wove at her work. The men stood listening. The song was beautiful, calm, and clear, and after the long violence of the sea it seemed to offer the promise of food, warmth, and rest beneath a roof. All but Eurylochus entered. Circe welcomed them, seating them in chairs and offering a mixture of cheese, meal, honey, and wine, into which she had stirred the herbs of forgetfulness and transformation. They drank. Then Circe touched them with her wand, and the men became pigs. Their bodies changed while their human minds remained caught within the new shape. She drove them into a pen and gave them acorns and other food fit for swine. Eurylochus, who had remained outside in fear, heard the confused sounds from within and fled back through the forest to the shore. He found Odysseus and told him what had happened. His voice faltered as he described the song, the house, the vanished companions, and the strange animals moving quietly near the door. Odysseus took his sword and set out at once. Eurylochus begged him not to go, for fear had settled so deeply in the surviving men that even the sound of the wind among the trees seemed to carry warning. But Odysseus continued alone along the woodland path. The ground beneath him was warm, and the afternoon had grown still, with only the far-off sea and the faint creak of branches moving against one another in the breeze. Then Hermes appeared before him. The messenger god came in the likeness of a young man, carrying a golden wand and standing among the trees where shafts of sunlight reached the forest floor. He told Odysseus that Circe would try to enchant him, as she had enchanted the others. Then he gave him a plant called mole, dark at the root and pale at the flower, a divine herb difficult for mortal hands to find. Odysseus was to take it before drinking Circe's potion. When she struck him with her wand, he was to draw his sword and rush towards her as though he meant to kill her. With this counsel held close in his mind, Odysseus walked onwards. The house stood waiting among the trees, its doorway open, its song still flowing outward into the calm green light. Circe received him as she had received the others. She invited him in, offered him a chair, and placed before him the sweet mixture in a shining cup. Odysseus drank, but the herb protected him. When Circe touched him with her wand and spoke the words meant to drive him into a pig pen, he remained unchanged. He drew his sword. The blade caught the warm light of the room, and he moved towards her with the sudden force of a man who had carried too much loss to surrender another companion. Circe cried out. She asked who he was, for no ordinary man, she said, could resist her potion, and when Odysseus told her his name, she understood that the prophecy of Hermes had been fulfilled. She had been told that Odysseus would come to her island after Troy, a man known for his intelligence and his endurance. Her fear gave way to wonder, and she invited him to put aside his sword and accept her friendship. Odysseus did not agree at once. He demanded that she release his companions and swear a solemn oath that she would not work further harm against him or his crew. Circe swore the oath by the ancient powers that gods and mortals feared to betray. Then she went to the pig pen, touched the enchanted men with another potion, and restored them to their human forms. They emerged stronger and younger than before, their faces fresh and their eyes bright with astonishment. When they saw Odysseus, they wept, and he wept with them, while even the house seemed to soften around their reunion. Circe welcomed the rest of the crew from the shore. She sent attendants to bring them in, to wash away the salt and dust of their journey, to clothe them in clean garments, and to prepare food and wine. For the first time since leaving Troy, the men found a place where they could rest, without the immediate fear of attack or storm. The house was warm, the food was plentiful, and outside the forest made its gentle layered sounds beneath the changing sky. They remained for a year. Days passed in the rhythm of meals, sleep, conversation, and the quiet work of recovery, while the ship waited in its sheltered bay, and the sea shone beyond the trees. At dawn, birds called from the branches. At midday, insects hummed in the sunlit clearings, and at night the wind stirred the leaves with a low, lulling sound, like waves moving over a distant shore. The sailors began to laugh again, though their laughter was quieter than it had once been. They remembered the companions they had lost, but they also felt their strength returning in the peaceful order of Circe's island. Odysseus sat sometimes outside the house and watched the western sky turn gold. The scent of wood smoke rose from the hearth, and beyond the forest he could hear the steady, soft crashing of the sea, always calling him onwards. At last his men came to him. They reminded him, gently and without anger, that they had homes still waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, and that comfort, however generous, could become another form of delay. Odysseus understood. He went to Circe and asked for help in continuing the voyage, and she did not refuse him, though her face grew thoughtful beneath the lamplight. There was one more path, she told him, that he must travel before he could find the road towards Ithaca. It was not a sea route marked by islands and harbours, but a journey to the distant boundary of the living world. He must go to the land of the Cimmerians, where mist and cloud covered the earth, and the sun's light was seldom seen. There he would find the entrance to the realm of the dead and seek the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes. Only Tiresias could tell him how to return home. Circe described the rites he must perform. He would dig a pit, pour offerings of milk and honey, wine, water, and barley, and sacrifice sheep so that the dead might gather and speak. The thought lay heavily upon the crew. They had faced storms, giants, hunger, and enchantment, but the road to the dead was a colder kind of fear, a place no sailor could see from the ship's deck. That evening the men sat in silence among the trees. The sounds of Aia were gentle around them. A breeze in the pine needles, the small crackle of the fire, and far away, the steady breathing of waves upon the beach. Among the crew was Elpenor, the youngest of the companions, a man not renowned for strength or counsel, but still beloved in the quiet way of those who share a long voyage. He had drunk too much wine and gone to sleep upon the flat roof of Circe's house, where the night air was cool and the stars seemed close. At dawn he woke suddenly, hearing the others preparing to leave. Still dazed, he forgot the ladder and stepped forward without seeing the drop. He fell from the roof and broke his neck. His death came quietly, unnoticed at first amid the bustle of departure, and his body remained behind as the others made ready for the journey that Circe had commanded. Odysseus and his crew went down to the shore. The ship was drawn back into the water, its keel sliding over wet sand with a low scraping sound, while the sail was raised against the pale morning wind. Circe herself came to the beach unseen by most of the men. She tied a ram and a black ewe aboard the ship, provisions for the rites below the world, and she sent a favourable wind to carry them towards the edge of the sea. The sailors took their places. Oars dipped and lifted in a slow, even rhythm. The wooden vessel creaked gently beneath their feet, and the island of Circe receded behind them, green and quiet beneath the sun. Soon, Aia became only a dark line on the horizon. Ahead lay the unknown waters leading towards the Cimmerians, and under the wide sky, Odysseus stood at the stern, listening to the calm, endless sound of the sea as it carried him towards the kingdom of the dead. The ship of Odysseus travelled onward from Aia beneath a wind sent by Circe. Its sail billowed gently in the cold, pale air, and the familiar wooden hull gave its low, patient creak as it moved through waters that seemed to lead beyond the ordinary world. The sailors sat close together, quieter than before. They had heard where they were bound, and even the rhythmic dip of their oars seemed subdued beneath the slow crashing of distant waves and the deep, steady breathing of men who could not easily sleep. At length, they reached the far country of the Cimmerians. In the old Greek imagination, it lay at the edge of the world, a shore where mist and cloud covered the land so completely that the bright path of the sun was never clearly seen. There was no warm blue horizon there, no sharp glitter of light upon the sea. Instead, the sky hung low and grey, and the coast appeared through the vapour in soft, uncertain shapes, while water lapped quietly against dark stones. The ship came to rest near the place Circe had described. Odysseus stepped ashore with the black ram and ewe she had placed aboard, and his companions followed in silence, their sandals making small sounds upon the wet earth. A chill wind moved across the shore. It carried neither the scent of olive trees nor the dryness of sun-warmed grass, but the smell of mist, cold water, and ground that seemed never to have known daylight. Odysseus found a place where two dark rivers were said to meet, the Pyriphlegethon, associated with fire, and the Cocytus, remembered as a river of lamentation. Their currents made a low, continuous murmur beneath the fog, a sound like rain falling far away. There he dug a small pit with his sword. He poured into it the offerings instructed by Circe, milk and honey, sweet wine, clear water, and white barley scattered carefully upon the shadowed earth. Then he promised gifts to the dead. When he returned to Ithaca, he would honour them with offerings, and for Tiresias alone he would sacrifice a black ram, the finest among his flock. At last he cut the throats of the sheep. Their blood ran into the pit, dark upon the soil, and the dead began to gather from the stillness beyond the river. They came not with the noise of an army or the bustle of a crowded town, but in a hushed procession of shadows. Old men, young women, children who had not lived long enough to grow, and warriors bearing the marks of battles long finished drifted from the gloom. Odysseus stood with his sword drawn, keeping them back from the blood until Tiresias should arrive. The blade caught what little light remained in the mist, while all around him rose the faint, sorrowful whisper of the dead. The first shade he recognized was Elpenor. The young sailor came forward with sadness in his voice, and Odysseus learned at last what had happened after the crew departed from Circe's island. Elpenor told how he had fallen from the roof in a moment of confusion and had been left unburied. He asked Odysseus if he ever returned to Aeaea to give him proper rites, a mound, an oar planted above it, and a marker bearing his name. Odysseus promised. Even in that dim place among the countless shadows, the request seemed simple and human, a wish not to vanish completely from the memory of those who had once shared food, labour and sea voyages. Then Tiresias came. The blind prophet carried a golden sceptre, and though he had lost the sight of the living world long before death, the poets believed that Persephone had allowed him to retain his clear understanding. He drank from the blood, and his voice became steady in the mist. He addressed Odysseus by name and told him that the sea god Poseidon still stood against him because of the blinding of Polyphemus. The road home, Tiresias said, would be difficult but not impossible. Odysseus must hold his course with discipline, must restrain his companions where he could, and must remember that one act of hunger or pride could bring ruin upon all who travelled with him. The prophet warned him above all about the island of Thrinacia. There grazed the sacred cattle and sheep of Helios, the sun god, animals watched over by the god's daughters, Lampetia and Phaethusa. If Odysseus and his men left those animals untouched, they might yet reach Ithaca after further suffering, but if they harmed them, Tiresias foretold, the ship would be destroyed, the crew would die, and Odysseus would return alone to his homeland. Even then, Tiresias said, Odysseus would find hardship in Ithaca. Men had filled his house and sought to marry Penelope, wasting his estate while imagining that the absent king would never return. Odysseus would overcome them, but his work would not end there. He would one day travel inland with an oar upon his shoulder, walking until he reached people who knew nothing of the sea and mistook the oar for a winnowing fan. There he would make peace with Poseidon through sacrifice. Only then would his own final years become quiet, and death would come to him gently, far from the sea, when he had grown old among a people at peace. Tiresias withdrew into the gathering mist. His words remained with Odysseus like the sound of a bell after it has been struck, clear at first and then gradually blending into the deep, grey silence of that unseen country. The shade of Anticlea came next. She was the mother of Odysseus, and when he saw her, his heart moved towards her before his mind could fully understand that she belonged now to the dead. He had left her alive in Ithaca when he sailed for Troy. Her hair had been dark then, and her voice had belonged to the rooms of his childhood, to the old house, to the stories and meals that had shaped him before he became a king and a soldier. Odysseus wanted to let her drink from the blood at once, but he remembered Tiresias's instruction and waited until the prophet had gone. Then Anticlea drank, and she knew her son. Though he stood before her in the cold air of the underworld, they spoke of Ithaca. Odysseus asked after his father Laertes, after Penelope, and after Telemachus, whose life had been spent almost entirely beneath the shadow of his father's absence. Anticlea told him that Laertes still lived, though the old man had withdrawn from the palace and spent his days in the country, grieving for his son. She told him that Penelope remained faithful, passing her nights in tears and her days in the difficult patience of waiting. Telemachus, she said, had grown into a capable young man. He held the king's lands in name, but the suitors consumed the wealth of the household and made his place in the palace uncertain. Odysseus asked how she herself had died. No illness had taken her, Anticlea explained, and no sudden wound had ended her life. She had faded from longing, from the ache of waiting for a son who did not return. He tried 3 times to embrace her. Each time his arms closed around nothing but air, and she passed through his hands like a shadow, light as a dream remembered in the first moments of waking. She told him that this was the way of the dead. The body once burned or buried did not remain, and the soul moved like breath away from the reach of living hands. Around them stood more women from the old heroic age. Odysseus saw mothers, queens, and daughters, whose names carried the memory of distant houses, marriages and tragedies woven into the songs of Greece. He spoke briefly with Tyro, who had loved the river god Enipeus, and with Antiope, whose sons founded great cities. There was Alcmene, mother of Heracles, and Megara, and Epicaste, known in later generations as Jocasta, whose family story had brought sorrow to Thebes. The underworld seemed to contain all histories at once. It was a place where the great and forgotten alike stood in the same dimness, their former crowns and garments reduced to the soft outlines of memory. Odysseus paused in his tale before the Phaeacians, for the night had grown late in their bright hall. King Alcinous urged him to continue, however, and the lamps were replenished while the sea beyond the palace kept up its gentle, unseen rhythm. So Odysseus told of the heroes he met among the dead. First came Agamemnon, once the high king of the Greek expedition, who had led a vast alliance to Troy, and returned home with hopes as bright as any sailor's first sight of land. But Agamemnon had been murdered in his own house by Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. He spoke bitterly of the moment when a man who had survived war and storm had sat down to a feast at home, only to find death waiting behind the familiar doors. He warned Odysseus not to return openly or trust too quickly. The warning was not against Penelope in particular, for Agamemnon did not know her heart, but against the dangerous assumption that a home remains unchanged when years have passed. Then Odysseus saw Achilles. In life, Achilles had been the most brilliant warrior among the Greeks, swift, beautiful, and almost impossible to defeat. Yet he too stood among the shadows with no joy in the glory that had once surrounded his name. Odysseus tried to honour him, saying that Achilles still ruled among the dead, and that no man had ever been more fortunate in fame. But Achilles answered with a truth that had lost none of its force in the world below. He would rather be alive, he said, serving as a poor labourer for a man with little land than rule over all the dead. For the first time, perhaps, the old ideal of heroic fame seemed to dim beside the simple value of breath, sunlight, and a place in the living world. Odysseus asked after Achilles' son, Neoptolemus. Achilles listened, and when Odysseus described the courage of the young man at Troy, the shade of the great warrior moved away with a little more lightness in his step. Ajax stood apart from them. He had been one of the strongest Greek champions, but after Achilles died, the armour of the fallen hero had been awarded to Odysseus rather than to Ajax. The insult had driven Ajax into madness and then death. Even now he refused to speak to Odysseus, turning away in silence while the mist moved quietly around them. Odysseus tried to address him with regret, but some wounds, the old poem understood, remained beyond repair, and the shade of Ajax drifted away without answering, carrying his grief deeper into the land of shadows. The king of Ithaca also saw Minos, the ancient judge, seated with a golden sceptre among the dead. Around him shadows brought their disputes, speaking in low, faded voices, while the great judge listened in the stillness that surrounded his seat. He saw Orion, the giant hunter, driving the shades of wild beasts across a meadow of asphodel. The movement was slow and dreamlike, as though hunting itself had become only a memory of pursuit beneath a sky without sun. Then came the figures of punishment. Tityus lay stretched upon the ground while vultures tore at him, and Tantalus stood in water beneath fruit he could never reach, thirsty and hungry despite the abundance surrounding him. Sisyphus pushed a great stone uphill, only to see it roll back each time he neared the summit. These images remained vivid in Greek thought because they gave shape to endless frustration, desire without fulfillment, labour without a final rest. Odysseus saw the shade of Heracles as well, or what the poet called his phantom, for Heracles himself was believed to dwell among the gods. The great hero moved through the underworld with bow and arrows, still wearing the aspect of a man who had known hardship in every part of his life. At last the crowd of the dead grew too great. Odysseus feared that Persephone might send forth some more terrible vision from the depths, and so he returned to the ship with his companions. The vessel waited on the dark shore. Its planks gave a soft, familiar creak as the men climbed aboard, and after the strange stillness of the underworld, even the quiet slap of water against the hull seemed like a welcome sign of the living world. They sailed back towards Aea. The mist gradually lifted behind them, the grey sky opened, and the ordinary colours of sea and cloud returned with a tenderness that must have seemed almost miraculous. When they reached Circe's island, they first found the body of Elpenor. The crew carried him to a high place and built his funeral pyre, working in silence beneath the warm light of the returning day. They burned his body with his armour. Then they raised a mound over his ashes and planted an oar upon it, so that anyone passing the island in years to come might know that a sailor named Elpenor had rested there after a long and troubled voyage. Circe received Odysseus once more. Her house stood peaceful among the trees, and the lions and wolves that wandered nearby moved quietly through the grass, their altered eyes holding the faint remembrance of their former humanity. Then Circe told Odysseus what remained ahead. Before he could reach the island of Helios, he must pass the Sirens, whose singing held such sweetness that sailors forgot all caution and turned their ships towards the fatal rocks. Their song, Circe explained, promised knowledge. The Sirens knew what had happened at Troy and what was happening across the wide earth, and they called to travellers with voices that seemed to understand every hidden longing. Odysseus must stop the ears of his men with softened beeswax. If he himself wished to hear the song, he must be bound tightly to the mast, and his companions must not release him, no matter how urgently he begged. Beyond the Sirens lay two further dangers. One was Scylla, a creature dwelling high in a cave upon a narrow strait, with 6 long necks and 6 terrible heads that reached down towards passing ships. On the opposite side waited Charybdis, a vast whirlpool that swallowed the sea 3 times each day and cast it up again. No vessel could safely escape if it came too close to that hungry, turning water. Circe told Odysseus to steer nearer to Scylla. It was a bitter instruction, for Scylla would take 6 men from the ship, but Charybdis might swallow the whole vessel and every soul aboard. Sometimes, she said, there is no harmless path. A captain must choose the loss that leaves something living to carry onwards. At last, Circe spoke of Thrinacia. There, beneath clear skies, grazed the sacred cattle of Helios, 7 herds of 50 cattle and 7 flocks of 50 sheep, watched by the god's daughters. Odysseus must avoid the island if possible. If storms or necessity forced the crew ashore, he must make every man swear that no one would touch the cattle, for the warning of Tiresias had already made clear what would follow. The next morning the crew prepared to leave. Circe sent them provisions, and the sailors carried jars and bundles down through the quiet forest, where dew rested on the leaves and birds called from the branches. The ship was eased into the water. Its keel slid over the wet sand with a soft scrape, and then the hull lifted free, settling into the small waves that rolled towards the shore in slow silver lines. Odysseus stood at the stern as the island began to recede. Circe remained upon the beach for a time, a still figure among the trees, while a gentle wind filled the sail and carried the vessel towards the open sea. The men took their places with the solemn obedience of those who have heard too much of what may await them. Oars dipped, ropes murmured, and the ship moved onwards through blue water under a widening sky. Ahead, invisible beyond the horizon, waited the voices of the Sirens, the rocks of Scylla, the turning mouth of Charybdis, and the bright island where the cattle of the sun god grazed in peace. Yet for that moment the sea was calm, and the ancient ship travelled quietly onwards, bearing Odysseus and his companions into the last, most dangerous reaches of their homeward road. The wind sent by Circe carried the ship of Odysseus away from Aea, across a sea that seemed calm only because its dangers remained beyond sight. The sail breathed gently above the deck, the ropes gave their faint, familiar murmur, and the ancient vessel moved forward with the soft creaking of wood that had endured many storms. Odysseus stood near the stern and repeated Circe's warnings to his companions. He spoke of the Sirens, of Scylla and Charybdis, and of the sacred cattle of Helios, while the men listened in grave silence to the slow washing of waves along the hull. First came the island of the Sirens. It appeared low upon the water, ringed by pale rocks and still beneath the bright sky, a place so quiet that the sailors could hear the smallest sounds aboard their own ship, a sandal shifting on a plank, a jar touching another jar, a man drawing breath. Odysseus took beeswax and softened it between his hands. One by one he pressed it into the ears of his companions, sealing them from the music that would soon travel across the sea. Then he asked the sailors to bind him upright against the mast. They fastened his wrists and chest with strong rope, drawing the knots tight, and he gave them one command above all others. Whatever he said when the song began, they must not release him. The ship moved onwards. The oars rose and fell with a quiet, disciplined rhythm, and the sea spread around them in long bands of blue, breathing against the hull with a calmness that seemed almost deliberate. Then the Sirens began to sing. Their voices came not as a sharp cry, but as a distant, delicate harmony, drifting over the water like wind through leaves, or a remembered melody heard from another room. They called to Odysseus by name. They told him that no sailor had ever passed their island without pausing to hear the sweetness of their song, and that whoever listened would sail away wiser, knowing the griefs of Troy and the hidden stories of the wide earth. The words reached deep into him. They offered not merely pleasure, but understanding, the promise that every loss might be explained, every mystery opened, and every sorrow shaped into a tale that could finally be held in the mind. Odysseus strained against the ropes. He called to his men and demanded that they loosen the bindings, but their ears were closed by wax and they could not hear his voice. Perimedes and Eurylochus saw him struggling. They did not stop the ship, nor did they look for explanation. Instead, they crossed the deck and tied more ropes around his body, securing him firmly to the mast while the oars continued their steady work. The sirens sang on as the ship passed beyond their shore. Their voices softened with distance, becoming first a faint music over the water, then something like the whisper of wind, and finally nothing more than the ordinary hush of the sea. Only then did the sailors remove the wax from their ears. They untied Odysseus, whose arms bore the marks of rope, and the ship continued onwards beneath a sky that seemed wider and quieter after the strange enchantment of the song. Soon the horizon narrowed. Dark cliffs rose from the water on either side, and the sea began to move differently, as though the channel itself possessed a pulse beneath its surface. Odysseus knew that they had reached the strait of Scylla and Charybdis. Circe had told him that no ship could sail safely through that passage without suffering, and the memory of her words rested heavily upon him. On one side stood a sheer cliff, so high that even a skilled archer could not have sent an arrow to its summit. Halfway up its face, hidden in shadow, was the cave of Scylla, black as an opening into the earth itself. From that cave reached 6 long necks, each bearing a head with a rows of sharp teeth. The ancient poets imagined Scylla as a creature beyond ordinary likeness, part woman in form and part sea beast, forever reaching down towards the ships that passed too near her rock. Across the strait lay Charybdis. 3 times a day, the sea there was swallowed into a vast hollow, and 3 times a day it was thrown back in a roaring surge, filling the air with foam and the deep thunder of water striking rock. Odysseus armed himself, though he had been warned that no weapon could defeat Scylla. He put on his helmet and took 2 spears, because the human heart often reaches for a weapon, even when the mind has been told that weapons will not be enough. The sailors rowed with all their strength. Their breathing deepened, their hands closed tightly around the oars, and the hull creaked beneath their feet as the current carried them through the tightening channel. To their left, Charybdis began to draw in the water. The sea fell away with a terrible hollow sound, and the sailors could see the dark turning depth, where foam, driftwood and current spun downwards into the unseen throat of the whirlpool. Odysseus ordered them to steer towards Scylla's cliff. It was the lesser danger, Circe had said, though no one who heard the words could call it small. The ship passed beneath the shadow of the rock. The air became cooler, and above them came only the faint sound of water dripping from the cliff face and the harsh cries of seabirds circling in the height. Then Scylla struck. 6 heads darted down with dreadful speed, each taking a sailor from the deck as easily as a fisherman might lift a small catch from the water. Odysseus saw his companions raised into the air. They cried out to him, calling his name as their hands reached towards the ship, and this, he later said, was the most terrible sight he had endured upon the sea. But the ship could not stop. The oars moved, the current carried them forward, and Scylla's cliff slid behind them while the 6 voices faded into the wind and the roar of the water. No burial rite could be given to those men. No mound could be raised beside a quiet shore. No oar planted in the earth above them, and the surviving sailors sat in silence as the sea widened once more around their ship. At last, the danger of the strait lay behind them. The air warmed, the waves regained their long, ordinary rhythm, and the wooden vessel rose and fell as gently as if it had never passed between death and the open sky. Ahead was Thrinacia, the island of Helios. It lay bright beneath the sun, with green slopes descending towards the shore, and broad pastures where the sacred herds moved slowly among the grass. Odysseus saw the cattle from the deck. They were strong and beautiful animals, dark against the light of the hillside, and their lowing travelled faintly across the water with the soft ringing of bells. He remembered Tiresias in the mist of the underworld. He remembered Circe in her forested hall, and the single instruction repeated by both: "Do not touch the cattle of the sun god." Odysseus gathered the men and made them swear an oath. If the ship came near Thrinacia, they would take only what they had brought, drink only their stored water, and leave the sacred animals unharmed. The men agreed, because grief had made them serious, and the warnings of prophets carried a weight no sailor could easily dismiss. Yet the sea is not always ruled by the promises made upon it, and a wind began to rise as they drew close to the island. The gusts came first in uneven breaths. Then the sky darkened, the sails strained, and rain moved across the sea in grey curtains, making the deck wet beneath the sailors' feet. Odysseus had no choice but to bring the ship ashore. The crew found a sheltered place near a spring, pulled the vessel above the reach of the waves, and waited while the storm settled over the island. One day passed, and then another. The wind did not weaken but blew steadily from the sea, making the trees bend and shiver, while the rain tapped upon leaves and the waves broke in slow, forceful lines along the shore. The sailors ate their provisions carefully. Bread became scarce, wine jars grew lighter, and the ordinary sounds of camp began to change. Fewer voices, longer silences, and the low stomach-deep sighs of men who knew their food would not last. Odysseus continued to remind them of the oath. He spoke of Helios, whose light crossed the sky each day, and whose sacred cattle grazed not far away, moving peacefully through the wet grass with no knowledge of the danger that hunger was bringing towards them. At last, when the wind still refused to turn, Odysseus went inland to pray. He asked the gods for a way to leave the island, and as he sat beneath sheltering trees, Athena placed a deep sleep upon him. The forest was quiet around him. Rain softened into a fine whisper on the leaves, and the gentle rustling of branches joined the distant crashing of the waves until sleep carried him beyond the sounds of the shore. While he slept, Eurylochus spoke to the crew. He had survived the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, the island of Circe, and the Strait of Scylla. Yet fear and hunger had worn away at his strength. He told the men that death by starvation was worse than death in a storm. Better, he said, to sacrifice the finest cattle to the gods and eat, hoping that Helios might forgive them, than to sit helplessly beside food while their bodies failed. The men listened. Beyond the camp, the cattle grazed beneath the sky beginning to clear, their breath rising softly in the cool air, their hooves pressing gently into the rain-darkened earth. They remembered the oath, but hunger can make an oath seem distant. They took some of the sacred animals while Odysseus slept, and they slaughtered them near the shore. The sound of the cattle's lowing ceased. Smoke rose from the fires, and the smell of roasting meat drifted through the wet air, mingling strangely with sea salt, damp grass, and the resinous scent of broken branches. Eurylochus tried to make the act seem holy. The men cut strips of wood and shaped them like horns, placing them around the cattle as offerings, because the real horns had been taken away with the animals. For 6 days they ate. The storm continued, and the ship waited upon the beach, its ropes tightening and loosening in the wind, its planks giving small groans as the tide shifted beneath it. On the 7th day, the weather changed. The clouds opened, the sky grew clear, and the sea beyond the island shone with a deceptive calm, blue and smooth beneath the returning sun. Odysseus woke and saw the bones and hides scattered near the camp. He understood at once what had happened, and grief passed through him, with a weariness deeper than anger. The daughters of Helios had already carried word to their father. Lampetia, keeper of the cattle, told the sun god that the companions of Odysseus had killed the animals that belonged to him alone. Helios went before Zeus and demanded justice. If those men were not punished, he said, he would withdraw the sun from the sky and shine instead among the dead below the earth. Zeus promised that punishment would come. For the moment, however, the sea lay calm, and the sailors, having eaten, repaired the ship and prepared to leave the island they should never have touched. They pushed the vessel back into the water. The keel slid over the sand with a low, scraping sound, the sail rose slowly, and the men took their places at the oars beneath a bright and cloudless sky. For a little while nothing happened. The ship travelled onwards over mild waves, and the sailors may have thought that the gods had accepted their poor offering, or that the old warnings had passed away like bad dreams. Then Zeus sent a storm. Clouds gathered from every direction, darkening the sky until the sun vanished, and the wind struck the sail with such force that the ship shuddered from prow to stern. The mast cracked. Rigging tore loose with a sharp, wild sound, and the broken spar fell upon the deck, killing the helmsman where he stood. Water rushed over the planks. The men cried out, grasping for ropes, benches, and one another, while thunder rolled above them and the sea lifted the ship high, before dropping it into dark troughs of foam. At last a bolt of lightning struck the vessel. The blow burst through the ship with a flash of terrible brightness, and the hull broke apart beneath the feet of those who had sailed so far from Troy. The companions of Odysseus disappeared into the storm. Some were thrown beneath the waves, some clung briefly to broken timbers, and some called out once before the wind and water carried their voices away. Odysseus himself held fast to the wreckage. He was driven back towards the strait he had passed before, and through the night the sea carried him alone, his body pressed against pieces of mast and keel. By dawn he saw again the cliffs of Charybdis. The whirlpool opened before him, swallowing the water with that same vast hollow roar, and the fragments of his ship were drawn towards its turning mouth. Odysseus let go at the last moment and caught hold of a fig tree growing from the cliff above. He clung to its roots and branches, suspended over the churning water, while the sea below roared and withdrew. For hours he remained there. His hands ached, salt water ran from his clothes, and the wind moved around the cliff with a lonely whistling sound, while the great whirlpool drew in and expelled the sea beneath him. At last Charybdis cast up the broken pieces of his ship. Odysseus dropped from the tree, landed upon the floating wreckage, and drifted away from the strait once more, alone in the vast water. For 9 days he travelled without ship or companions. The sun rose and set above him, the stars passed overhead, and the sea moved him wherever it wished, sometimes gently, sometimes with long swells that lifted him towards the empty horizon. There were moments when the water lay quiet, and he could hear nothing but the light lap of waves against the timber supporting him. At other times night winds rose, carrying spray across his face, and making the broken wood knock softly against itself beneath his tired hands. On the 10th day, the sea brought him to Ogygia, the island of Calypso. It emerged from the water as a green and sheltered place, ringed by cliffs and bright with trees, so peaceful in appearance that it seemed to belong to another world. Odysseus reached the shore barely alive. The waves carried him onto the sand with a gentle, repeated motion, and for a long while he lay listening to the tide draw back through the stones. Calypso found him there. She was a nymph, a divine daughter of Atlas, and her island home lay among cypress, alder, and poplar trees, where springs ran clear through the grass, and birds nested in the high branches. She brought him into her cave. It was a place of deep shade and firelight, with vines around the entrance and the soft, continuous sound of water flowing nearby, while the distant sea gave its low-breathing answer beyond the trees. There Odysseus recovered. Calypso offered him food, warm clothing, and the comfort of a peaceful dwelling, and the years began to pass in a way that perhaps only immortals could find natural. She loved him, and wished him to remain. The poems say that she offered him immortality and freedom from old age, gifts beyond the reach of any mortal king, but the heart of Odysseus continued to turn towards Ithaca. Each day he went down to the shore. He sat upon a rock above the water and looked westwards, watching the waves approach in slow, silver folds, and listening to their endless, quiet collapse upon the beach. He thought of Penelope, he thought of Telemachus, now no longer the child he had left behind, and of the stony paths of Ithaca, where olive trees rustled in the evening wind. The years on Ogygia were gentle. yet gentleness could not erase longing. The cave was warm, the spring sang over stones, and the birds called from the branches, but none of these sounds was the sound of his own home. At last, on Olympus, Athena spoke again for Odysseus. The goddess remembered the king sitting alone beside Calypso's sea, and she brought his suffering before Zeus during an assembly of the gods. Zeus agreed that the time had come. He sent Hermes, the swift messenger, over the sea, with his golden sandals shining as he crossed the waves, and his wand held lightly in his hand. Hermes came to Ogygia in the soft light of afternoon. The island was fragrant with cedar smoke and flowering herbs, and Calypso sat at her loom within the cave, singing quietly as her shuttle moved back and forth through the woven threads. She welcomed Hermes, though she knew that a divine messenger rarely came without a command. They shared food and drink, and beyond the entrance the 4 springs murmured through the grass while the sea moved steadily against the shore. Then Hermes told her what Zeus required. Calypso must let Odysseus go, despite her love, and despite the emptiness his departure would leave upon her island. Calypso was sorrowful and angry. She spoke of how gods themselves often loved mortal women without blame, yet goddesses were condemned when they cherished mortal men, and her complaint carried the old ache of someone asked to surrender what she had protected. Still, she could not oppose Zeus. She went to find Odysseus on the shore, where he sat in his usual place with his eyes upon the horizon and the sound of waves breathing around him. She told him that he was free to leave. At first he did not believe her, for a promise of escape after so many years could feel as unreal as a dream heard in sleep. He asked her to swear that she meant him no hidden harm. Calypso gave the solemn oath, and then she guided him through the practical work of departure. Together they cut trees from the island's forest. The axe struck the trunks in slow, ringing blows, and the scent of fresh-cut pine and cedar rose through the warm air while birds shifted in the branches above. Odysseus shaped the timber into a raft. He set planks together with care, raised a mast, made a sail, and prepared the vessel as a man who had not forgotten the skills of sea travel, despite the long stillness of his captivity. For 4 days he worked. The rhythmic sounds of labour filled the island, wood splitting, tool scraping, rope being twisted and tightened, and the soft wash of waves waiting beyond the shore. On the 5th day Calypso brought him provisions. She gave him bread, water, wine, and clothing, and she sent a gentle wind across the water, one that would carry his small craft away from Ogygia towards the distant world of men. Odysseus set out upon the raft. The shore receded behind him, its green trees and shadowed cave becoming smaller beneath the sun, while ahead stretched the unbroken blue of the sea. For 17 days he sailed. He steered by the stars, keeping the Great Bear to his left as Calypso had instructed, and each night the raft moved with the slow, creaking rhythm of wood, meeting water beneath the cold lights of heaven. Then Poseidon saw him. The sea god was returning from the land of the Ethiopians, and from far above the water he saw Odysseus travelling freely, where he had hoped the king might never travel again. Poseidon gathered clouds. The winds rose from different directions, meeting above the raft, and the sea began to heave beneath Odysseus, with the dark, swelling force of a god's anger. Waves broke across the deck. The mast shook, the sail snapped in the wind, and Odysseus held tightly to the timber while the small raft was lifted and thrown across the water. He thought of the many times he had faced death at sea. Troy, the Cicones, the Cyclops, the Straits, the wreck of Helios's ship, all seemed to return in the roar of the storm, while the foam gathered white around him. The goddess Ino saw his struggle. Once a mortal woman and later honoured among the sea powers, she rose from the water and offered Odysseus a shining veil. She told him to remove his clothes, leave the raft when it broke, and swim towards the land that lay somewhere ahead. If he wore the veil beneath his chest, she promised, he would not drown. Odysseus hesitated, fearing another trick of the gods. But the storm grew stronger, and when the raft finally broke apart, he followed Ino's counsel, wrapped the veil around himself and entered the sea. For 2 days he swam and drifted. The waves carried him over deep water, and at night he heard the wind passing above the surface, while the sea rose beneath him in long, dark breaths. On the 3rd day, land appeared. It was the island of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians, though Odysseus did not yet know its name, and its cliffs rose before him with no easy place to come ashore. The surf crashed hard against the rocks. Odysseus searched along the coast, his arms growing weak, until he found the mouth of a river where calmer water flowed into the sea between low banks. He swam into the river and prayed to its god. The current softened, the waves eased behind him, and he reached the shore, crawling onto the sand beneath the gathering dusk. He released Ino's veil into the water as she had commanded. It floated away across the gentle current, and he watched it disappear while the last light faded from the sky. Odysseus was naked, bruised, and almost without strength. He walked inland until he found a place between 2 olive trees, their branches woven together above a bed of fallen leaves. There he covered himself with leaves and lay down. The night breeze moved softly through the olive grove, making a quiet rustling sound above him, while beyond the trees the waves of Scheria reached the shore in slow, steady rhythm. Athena placed sleep upon him. For the first time after the storm his breathing became deep and even, and the weary king of Ithaca rested beneath the ancient olive branches, unaware that the next morning would bring the Phaeacian princess Nausicaa, and with her the first true opening of the road towards home,